my ex-student, Veronica. She studied at high school here in Verbania, but then she had an eventful life and she's still having lots of interesting experience. So she's going to tell us.
So my name is Veronica Bellintani and I've studied here English with my professor at the Cavalieri High School. After that I went to study Arabic at university and I did a master in transitional justice. I've been working with refugees for the past 4 years, and in this experience I've met my now husband, who is a Syrian guy from Damascus, who has been through a lot during his life after the uprising in 2011, and he has been tortured by the Assad regime for 9 months, and I'm willing to tell his story to you and to my professor and try to share his experience.
Yes, tell us. Can you introduce the situation, the historic situation, the present situation in Syria, please?
So, Syria had been under the dictatorship of the al-Assad family since the first coup in 1973. So, at the beginning, the father, Hafez al-Assad, was ruling the country until his death in 2000, and then his son took the power, and he had been ruling the country under a fascist kind of dictatorship. In 2011, after the various uprisings of the Arab Spring in Egypt and Libya, also in Syria, they started to go into the street and ask for reforms and democracy, elections. So they weren't really asking for a regime change, but they were asking for reforms and for being able to participate in the country. The regime decided to respond to this kind of protest with really harsh repression, by shooting protesters and by arresting them. And my husband was arrested for the first time in 2011 after being arrested outside the university with a lot of other students. He had been there for like 3 months, but his situation at the beginning was less bad than the after one, because it was like the beginning, so the regime was not actually looking for enemies. The second time he was arrested, he was helping people during the revolution, because after the start of the repression, people were starting to try to defend themselves. So people were trying to provide medicines, provide food to areas that were besieged by the army, to areas that were like the internet was cut so that the human rights violation could not be shared to the outside world. So his job was basically in the revolution to provide internet to those areas so they could be able to share what it was going through, because he was working in an internet company. He was found out by the regime and he was arrested in March 2012, and he had been inside the prison branch that is called the death branch. It's called the death branch because most of the people die there for torture, and had been tortured there for 9 months. So I'm not gonna tell all the graphic details because obviously they are really bad, but he has been through many beatings, the use of electroshock, sexual violence, rape, and he was tortured with various techniques that are like famous to be the worst ones in the world. Like some of them were somehow created by some Nazi people that were collaborating with the Assad regime. And additionally, there were also the horrible conditions in the prisons. So there were like overcrowded cells, there was totally lack of medical care, there was no food, there was no possibility to take showers. So he told me that when he was released in November, he was only 34 kilos. He always says that after his experience, he has been having much more anger, much more sense of shame and guilt, for shame of what he had been through and guilt for having survived while other people in the same cell have been killed under torture, and he didn't do anything to save them because it was impossible. But on the side of the person he is, I know that he is a person that he doesn't have any grudge. He doesn't want to take revenge. He wants to, other than taking revenge on a violent side, he feels that his real revenge is to be able to build something good out of what they are trying to do on him. So he always says, they try to rob me of happiness, of a life of hopes, of dreams, and of being able to have a good relationship and so on, which instead is not true, because I'm able to try to build a life, I have a good relationship and so on. So he says that usually people, when they torture you, they say, if you don't die under my torture, this torture will try to kill you outside, because you're not going to be able to have a social life, you're not going to be able to trust people, you're not going to be able to have a relationship with a person which is not based on violence and submission. So one time we read this book by Viktor Frankl. He is a psychologist who is a survivor of the Holocaust, and he develops a kind of theory of how you survive this kind of situation. And he says this quote that is printed in my mind. It says that the only freedom that people cannot take from you is the freedom to be able to react in your own way to what people do to you. Mm. So they may have taken from him the freedom of being able to live normally during those 9 months, to be able to see his family, to be able to eat and shower like normal people. But they didn't take from him the freedom of being able to go out there and say, I'm going to react from this situation in the way I want. You're not going to decide, and you're not going to influence how I'm going to build my life with this. So this is really some kind of rule that he put in his mind, and he always tried to see his past and say, I built so many things from there, and they didn't manage to rob me from that thing. So he's really a person with so much hope, so much dreams for the future. He's really an optimist person. He's so much optimistic, sometimes makes me so mad, because even in the most annoying thing is always like, oh, it's gonna be fine, and this is his kind of way to react and also to heal from the situation he had. So I found this so much inspiring, because it means that you can go for anything. Because he told me that after his detention period, he tried to kill himself many times. But then he realized that dying would make his torturers happy. What makes his torturers not happy is to see people being able to build a good life and being able to get back on their feet and building something that is much, much better than what it was their life even before.
A really shocking experience, and we don't know anything about it watching TV, or we have no information about it. And when did you meet your husband?
I met him on Twitter in 2015, because I was using Twitter to get information from Syria, because Italian media are not that much willing to talk about Syria daily. So I wanted to know every day what was going on, what's happening in Syria. So I started to look on Twitter, and he was one of the most important activists talking on the social network. So we started talking, and we met only 2 years ago in Istanbul. So this is how we met. We met many years after his release and everything. So obviously, as a person, physically he is a different person from. You would never know that he's been a torture survivor. You would never know, because he looks like a normal person, normal guy, normal 28 guy.
He's not 34 kilos now.
No. But when you know him more closely and you see how he lives his life and so on, you can see that there are many psychological issues that he's still going through after 4 years from his detention. So maybe on the outside part is fine, but on the inside there are many scars that he still have to work on.
Can you give us some examples of psychological difficulties, problems?
When I met him the first time, we were staying together in a hotel in Istanbul, and he was taking a shower every 2 hours. Every 2 hours he was taking a shower because he was feeling dirty. Because when he was detained, he was never allowed to take a shower. So for 9 months, he was never allowed to take a shower. He was living in the dirt of the detention, and he was living, of course, with the blood and horrible things that you can get from being beaten and being electrocuted during the day, So when he met me, I think that he felt dirty and maybe ashamed of what he went through. So all of this came back, and he was going to take a shower every 2 hours until I actually stopped him and saying, "Why are you doing this?" So he explained me, and I told him, "No, you're not dirty, you're fine." So he understood that it was just in his mind. Then, so this kind of situation was solved immediately after I explained him that his life was normal. Other things are still happening now. So I think that almost every night he has nightmares. So he has always the same nightmare of being arrested, or most of the times of being tortured. So for example, we sleep, and at a certain time you can see that he's shaking and he's talking about something strange in Arabic. I don't understand what he's saying. So, but you see that it's something painful, you see that it's something that I need to wake him up. And it's usually like being tortured. He told me that he dreams of being arrested, he told me that he dreams of being tortured. One time he told me that he dreamt of me being tortured, so it's something that gets even worse because it's affecting now people that you love. He has flashbacks, so sometimes there are some small things that still make him feel about his past life. So a crowded bus is really something that he is not still able to deal with, because when he was living in those detention cells, the detention cells were really, really small, and he was forced to live there with 60 people. So for example, if they wanted to go to sleep, half of the people would have to stand and half could just go on the floor to sleep. So it was really crowded, and so when you see something crowded, it feels like panic attack. And the same with knocking on doors, because it reminded him of the guards calling people to get to go tortured and so on. Another thing that it was kind of shocking for me, because I wasn't expecting a kind of reaction like that, because when I started to live with him, I knew that as a torture survivor, he needed to get some help from me. So I started to think about, from the experience I know of other people in torture centers, I started to think, okay, crowded places, torture, electroshock, so those are the things that I know. But I found out one day that he is completely scared by cockroaches and all those kind of insects. From my experience and from my knowledge of what is happening in the study prisons, I didn't know exactly this kind of detail. But he told me that when he was trying to sleep in the detention cell was so dirty that when you were laying down, your whole body was kind of covered by the insects of the cell, so cockroaches and so on. So one time we were going around a bazaar, so a local market of Turkish people, and it was summer and it was like really hot, and there was a cockroach just going around. He saw it, and I think that at least for 3 hours he didn't manage to sleep because he was scared, he was crying, he was really having a huge panic attack. I tried to make him feel better, and I thought that I managed to do that. But at the end he slept with his hands over his face, as he was doing in the detention cell when he was trying to cover his face from the cockroaches going around his face and nose and so on.
Do you think he will have psychological assistance sooner or later? He will need psychological help from a therapist.
So, in Arabic society, like in Syrian society, psychology and therapy is not something common. It's something that is a taboo. You don't say that you are going to a psychologist for two main reasons. The first reason is that people don't believe in psychology. They think that if you have a problem, you deal with yourself in your house, in your family, you don't have to say to someone else. The second reason is that in a dictatorship you don't trust anyone, so you don't go to someone to tell him your secrets and your problems. So most of Syrians who go through torture experience, they don't share their experience, so they go through a lot of trauma that they're not able to process, and so they keep on having problems. My husband decided to go through therapy. As soon as he got to Istanbul, he managed to find an English speaker therapist and go through some kind of help. He told him everything, and he helped me a lot to go through some of his problems, but obviously I think that therapy can be really good, but there are some things that are not in the reach of a therapist too. So, for example, he told me that he was too ashamed to explain all of his sexual abuse and sexual violence. So he never talked about the sexual violence, even with the therapist. He told me some little things because this abuse he went through was a problem with that for me and for him at the beginning of our relationship. So he had to tell me that everything was normal. But I know that he didn't tell me everything. So there are some issues that he has been working on because of the therapist, and they are succeeding. Other things that even with the help therapist are still there and are visible.
And what are you doing now? Your job, your study?
So now I have just finished my thesis. So I did a thesis on the disappeared in Syria, and I've just submitted it to my master.
And I think you're going to Belfast presently.
Yeah, I went to Belfast some week ago, and I'm going back in December. And I studied there transitional justice, which is the justice that you try to get after conflict. And
Transitional justice.
Yeah, it's the justice after transition. It is supposed to be after you end a conflict or after you end a dictatorship. So when you're trying to redress the wrongs and the human rights abuses committed during a dictatorship or a conflict. So what I'm trying to learn is what could be done for Syria. So I'm trying to get all the possible information to try to get the same thing. And I decided to go to study to Belfast because they went through a conflict. So you learn not only by the professor but also by the normal people you go around. So I met torture survivors. I met people who are still looking for information about the disappeared people, or families that their loved ones have been killed by, for example, the British Army. So they're trying to get some information, but the state instead says we are not responsible for anything. So it's a whole kind of process of still trying to get something, and so I could learn from them. So I volunteer with a care center to try to give some psychological help to people. So I try to volunteer with them and try to learn from them for my husband and also for other Syrians. So it was a really great experience.
And then when are you getting back to your husband?
I'm going back to my husband on Monday.
And where do you live?
I live in Istanbul, so I live in the city center of Istanbul, and we are forced to stay there until he gets his Italian citizenship, because as every kind of opponent of the Assad regime, his passport is not valid. It has been completely made invalid 2 years ago. He have tried to renew it so that to be able somehow to have a chance somewhere else too, but the consulates say that people like him, so that they are on a special list, are not allowed to get the passport. So we are staying there until the Italian passport comes, let's say.
As your husband, he should have the right to an Italian.
Yeah. After 3 years from marriage, he's allowed to get an Italian citizenship.
After?
So 3 years.
3 years. And now, when did you marry him?
12th of July.
The 12th of July. So
I still have a lot of time. But Turkey right now is it's problematic on a political side, because of course Erdogan is not the best democratic ruler at all. But on the side of Syrian lives, there are 4 million Syrians, and the situation for Syrians there is okay. So we cannot complain about Turkey, also because if there is no Turkey, there is only as options Mauritania and South Sudan. So obviously I wouldn't like to move to Mauritania and South Sudan.
Much better than...
It's much better to stay put in Turkey and hope for the best, and let's try to.
And do you work there? Can you have a job? Can he have a job?
He has a job. He works as a freelance researcher and translator for some American universities. He's doing a project on oral history on the Syrian war and human rights violations. I'm working remotely for this Syrian organization. I mean, there are many Syrians that are victims of what I've been talking about before. They're living in Turkey, so I'm working with them, and I travel to other areas for their advocacy projects and so on.
So other areas, I mean, you don't stay only in Istanbul, but
I
do you
travel
go?
all around Turkey, so I do Istanbul and the area next to the border. I go sometimes to Lebanon, and those are the main areas of Syrians. Then Europe is more as a advocacy place where you go to the Geneva, you go to Berlin, and so on. So my work with Syrians is in Turkey.
In Turkey.
So the other things is more a political, diplomatic thing that I don't really like. I prefer to work with victims and try to empower them. So because I believe that since I tried when my husband first told me a story to try to get justice in Italy. As a person that is linked to Italian citizen, I thought that it was possible to do the same thing that they're doing in Germany or in Austria or in Sweden. So I believe that when Syria gets better, when people are allowed to come back, when Syrians are allowed to come back, and also the whole issue of Syria ends and gets better, also Europe will be better. Because right now, Syria is almost all under the control of the regime, except an area in the north where there are 3 million Syrians. All those 3 million Syrians are people that have been displaced by other areas and refuse to surrender to the government because they know that in the moment they surrender, they are arrested, they are detained, and they are tortured, and they are killed. So the moment that the regime is going to do another political offensive, military offensive against those areas, those people are going to flee. So there are other 3 million people. So my opinion is that if populist, xenophobic, and racist the governments in Europe don't want other refugees, they should support a political transition in Syria where Assad is not able to kill all those people and make them flee instead of supporting the cause of this refugee wave. So that's why I'm saying if the situation in Syria gets better, also the whole discourse against refugees and immigration is not going to have any support because it's not going to be that big like before. So that's what I'm thinking.
And would you like to live in Syria or in Italy eventually with your kids?
I don't know. I'm able to live everywhere.
What would your husband think?
I think that my husband would love to live in Syria because he had been forced to lose his country and his family, and he had not seen his life, his love, his homeland for so long that he wants to go back to live in Syria as also a form of revenge, I believe. You know, you come back with your dignity restored and you say you didn't break me, I managed to get my life back and we are able to go back with our life even if you tried to kill us all. So this would be coming back to Syria and building something good is a revenge. So I think that Italy and Verbania will be a good holiday place to come. But I would like to be in a place where I could be useful, so I think that would be more useful for Syria in Syria than in Verbania, which is kind of sad, but you go where you are useful.
Yes. Well, that has been a pleasure, even if I heard so many bad things about Syria, but it's nice to see how well you're doing for Syria.
I think that you hear a lot of bad things about Syria. You can only think about war and destruction and slaughtering and so on. But there are so many people that are trying to build something out of this horrible mess. There are people trying to get justice. Even now in Syria, there are people trying to build small democratic councils. They are trying to build education. They are trying to build schools even under bombs. So they're trying to build life outside of the bombs and the death that the Assad regime is trying to perpetuate all over the place. And I always say, when I talk about my husband, one thing is that even if my story can be sad because of all this torture, because of the psychological impact it's still going through, I always say that I'm privileged because I had the privilege of a future with a person that I love, which is something that many other women have been robbed of because their husband had been tortured to death or still disappeared. So what I always say is that if my story somehow had impacted you on a negative side, you have to think that I'm the lucky one, and people that have been going through this till now should get the help they need. So when I say this, I say that people should know, that people should know what Assad regime means like. It means torturing people, making people be completely devastated for years, and try to know that when you hear people saying that peace is coming, peace in Syria is not coming until all people are outside prisons and no one is tortured to death.
Well, I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.